Hey guys, behind me is a 1980 MGB. It needs engine mounts. What's happened is that, and I have no idea how common this is, but maybe you've got a similar problem. What's happened is that it's easy to go into reverse, easy to go into first and second, but third and fourth, it's as if they're not there. And what's ended up happening is the engine mount on the passenger side has simply sheared into two pieces. It's not doing anything. The engine is cantered over to the edge. And so when you go to shift into third and fourth, the gear stick's literally hitting the tunnel. There's just no room to shift into those gears. So we've got to do both of those engine mounts, and then there's a couple at the back, the transmission mounts. We may as well do those at the same time because if front are bad, the back are probably worse. Anyway, that's my project, so let's take a look and see what we've got. Okay, now if you're underneath the car, there is I'll try and keep a light on it. There's a nut that goes right here. This is an engine mount here that I'm not sure you could see, but I'll bring the camera around. You can see that's sheared into two pieces, and so that's the issue. That's why the engine's sitting on its side. I've already taken the nut off, and then the next step is going to be to take those other two nuts off. Well, we got to jack up the engine a little bit first. Block of wood under the oil pan is fine. If you don't have a lift, you can do it with a floor jack. I do have a lift with a jack, so I'm going to be using that. But you could take those nuts off and then remove the engine mount. That's the easy part. The hard part is on the driver's side here. Let's see if I can show you. The engine mount on the driver's side is behind that steering rack, and that's where the bolt goes on the bottom. And so the issue is that the steering rack's in the way. Not every MGB is going to have that issue. I'm not really sure which ones do and which ones don't, but definitely 1980 left-hand drive, that's going to be a problem. So I am going to have to remove the steering rack and part of the steering column in order to get at the nut that holds on that engine mount. Now what we're going to do, as long as you don't rotate the tie rod, just leave that fixed on both sides. You won't be changing the alignment, but we are going to be undoing these nuts. I'm going to have to pop the steering rack out of both of these steering links, and then up at the top there is another nut at a universal joint. I'm going to be taking that apart. Okay, now to get the tie rods off, actually it's always a good idea to leave the nut at least partially threaded on, so I'm going to put that back a little bit. Having it attached to the threads with a little bit of space means that you can get it out of where it is, but at the same time you're protecting the threads. Go. I can't get a socket on here, but what you can do, wedge a screwdriver in so that the nut won't turn. And then once it does get low enough, you should be able to get a socket on there. Show you the bolt because with the camera, the only way to see it is with the camera in my way. So that's the one that we took out down there. This is the one that we need to get out. So pretty easy to get at from the top. You may have in some years a cover that you have to take off just to get at it, but that's what I'm going to take out. And then right there, this bolt going through, that's a universal joint that couples the steering to the rest of the steering column on the upper half. And I just need to loosen that, put a screwdriver in to kind of pry it open a little bit, and then I should be able to pull it out. Okay, I just want to point out real quick that there were the same 2 bolts on the other side, so don't forget to do those. They happened to have been easier to get at, so forgot to film them. But then, once everything's loose, go. Okay, as you can see, I should be able to get a wrench on that nut right now. Again, the camera's going to be in the way. It's a little bit of a tight fit. Some of that's because the engine's actually cantered over to the side, but I need to get both of the engine mounts out anyway, so I shall persevere. Okay, I've got the engine supported from underneath. You'll notice there's a couple blocks of wood, and then I've got a jack under the engine. So I've jacked it up just enough to take some of the pressure off of the engine so that it's supported only by the jack. The engine mounts aren't actually doing anything, at least not in front. So. Okay, now definitely disconnect the battery if you're going to do this. I am going to take off the alternator. You don't have to, but it makes it a little easier. But like I said, definitely disconnect the battery first. And if you're not sure why, don't disconnect the battery, you'll figure it out. If you're taking the alternator off, pay attention to how many washers or shims there are, because you will need to put them back to make sure everything lines up. Make sure to drop any bolts that you take out. You don't want to be able to find those. Okay, and even more important than the bolts, there's going to be a number of shims. Make sure that you keep the same amount on either side as you take these off. Okay, and here is half of my engine mount. Well, it's not mine, but here's half of the engine mount. This is what was causing the engine to fall over onto the side, and the reason that it wasn't able to shift into gear. Pro tip, if you're going to put a new piece in, you saw how difficult it was for me to reach some of that stuff when I was underneath. Get yourself new hardware. If you have new hardware, you will be able to thread things on with your finger and get it really close, and you'll only have to get the wrench in there for that last little bit. So always throw out the hardware, get new stuff. It'll make it a lot easier when you go to put it back together. Okay, now I'm removing one shim because this was actually the top of the engine mount, so it'd actually just be two. We put the shims in. See if you can slide everything into place. If you can't, you may need to jack the engine up a little more. Don't forget to tighten it up at the bottom. You'll probably have to take the engine off the jack to do this. You don't want to stretch it out unnecessarily. And also, if the jack is right here and so is your head, it's a lot easier to reach. Some of this you may end up doing by feel. Jack the engine back up. Okay, so you may have to use a pry bar. It's okay if you do, but still make sure that the engine's jacked up, because when you take the pry bar out, you don't want everything to fall. By the way, if you look at this, this is off center, so you want to make sure it goes back on the same way that it came off, but if you forget, just kind of eyeball it with the two holes in the engine and see whether or not the threads are going to line up closer one way or another. Like this I know will not fit, so I know it goes this way, and I also know that it went that way before, so we're good there. It goes without saying, just make sure everything's well supported. Try and keep your fingers out of anywhere where they could be pinched. Yeah, remember to install the ground strap, because if you don't, then you have to unbolt it just like this. I guess I could edit it out, but where's the fun in that? Okay, once that's bolted in, let the engine back down.
engine mounts done. It's time to get this engine stay rod. There's 2 more mounts there, well, 2 halves anyway, and then the gearbox one. This was already loose. And then the gearbox mounts. Okay, now that's pretty easy to put back in, but I'm going to address the transmission mounts first because that will give me a little bit more room. So just like the front, although the front was literally torn, so I wanted to make sure I got those in good shape first. Just like the front, you're going to lift up basically on the back half of the engine, and that'll take the weight off of these. And I don't actually feel a bolt in here, so that's wonderful. Or a nut rather, sorry. There is one on this side. Okay. Let's see if we can figure out what size. All right, so something alarming is that there are no bolts on either, no nuts on either of these mounts. So they've basically just been sitting there with nothing holding them in place. That's lovely. So anyway, what we're gonna do is kind of build a platform here like we did before. And we're going to raise up the gearbox. Just in case they're not whatever size I expect them to be. Ugh. Okay, you can actually take a lot of the bolts out with the gearbox just sitting on it because it's resting in a V shape. Once that's done, however, then it's time to raise it up. That is why it wouldn't shift. One and two. A couple of tips. So first of all, you can lower this, but when you go to put it back in, the bolts aren't necessarily going to fit. And so what you will want is an edge like this you can put into a hole and you can kind of manipulate it so that you can move the bolt holes around. That's how you're going to be able to get it back in. Same thing with up here. You're not necessarily going to be able to get all the bolts in unless you put everything together while the transmission is not connected to you connect it to the mounts and then just kind of leave everything loose, put it together. It's a pain. You kind of have to figure it out as you go and see what works for your car, but a tool like this that you can put into a bolt hole and kind of manipulate pieces around, that's helpful. And then the other piece that is very helpful, just had it in my hand. There it is. There are some bolts up here, and I have a ratchet that can go at an angle like that. Makes it much easier so that you can go in and work from an odd angle. If I didn't have this, a flex head ratchet was okay, but even that was a bit awkward. So if you're going to tackle doing gearbox mounts on an MGB, get one of these ratchets that you can turn the head 90 degrees and you should have a much easier time. So now, only thing left, we've got to do the stay bar. There we go. Not every MG has this, but if you do have it, it basically helps to stabilize the engine, reduce vibration and all that. All right, we've got new engine mounts, new stabilizer mounts, new gearbox mounts. That should adjust the gear lever so that it's actually close to centered again. Let me just make sure that I've tightened everything. I've got to put the steering back in. Make sure your steering wheel is straight. Try not to turn it. Your wheel alignment should not have changed, but your steering wheel may be off-center when you're done with this. So just be aware of that. Tie rods are turning, which they probably will be. If you put a little bit of downward pressure on them, it gets the taper to dig in for you, and that will eventually stop it from moving.